Is Uzbekistan's financial market a gold mine for foreign investors? To discuss the financial markets over a couple of decades and future expectations, I'm joined today by Michael McGaughy, Head of Research for Fusion Wealth Management. Thank you for joining us, Michael. Can you please share a little bit about your financial profile and your involvement in Uzbekistan financial market?
Sure. So we've been investing in Uzbekistan since I first made my trip there about a month after the Uzbek som was depreciated or set free, I should say. When that happened, I think it was in September 2017 that happened. I think within 2 months, I had organized a trip to Uzbekistan to look at the Uzbek markets and to see the country. I had previously been in Kazakhstan in 2014 when that market hit a very low price and the Kazakh tenge also crumbled. And when I was in Kazakhstan, I met a lot of Uzbeks that they maybe weren't in the top positions, but they were pretty prominent positions. And I never really thought of it, but when I asked them about, why are they there, they said, Uzbek really is the center of Central Asia. It's where all the, I guess, for lack of a better word, for a lot of the brain power is, the good universities are. And there are a lot of Uzbek restaurants all over Kazakhstan. So I kind of put in the back of my mind that at some point, if anything ever happens there, it might be a good place to check out and look at things. And then, lo and behold, once the ex-president Islam Karimov passed away, you started seeing every month or so articles about the reforms that were taking place on the political side in Uzbekistan. And then everything was looking positive on that, all the reports coming out, and there wasn't a whole lot. It's still a very underreported place. And sure enough, lo and behold, in about a year after the political reform started, the currency reform took place. And that got me on the plane because all of a sudden, assets for US dollars investors were half price overnight. And it's like any great half price sale, you want to check it out and see what's there. So I think it was November or maybe early December 2017. I spent a couple of weeks in Tashkent, knocking on doors and trying to find out who's doing what. And our fund has been invested in Uzbekistan since, I think, January 2000, or basically the first quarter of 2018. So you asked a couple of questions there, but our fund, we're a small fund, it's a private fund. And what we do is, or my strategy is to invest when and where there's a financial crisis or a big depreciation or devaluation like we saw in Uzbekistan, basically when you can get assets, equities, listed companies that are at what I would think are generational low valuations. And Uzbekistan hit the bill there.
So opportunity based, I would say.
Yeah, very much. Basically, you're taking it. It's kind of like the opposite of investing in a boom. So a lot of times, there's a boom or how would you say, a bubble, I should say, is what most people call it. You don't know when the bubble is going to pop. Things are super expensive. It's going to be something. You don't know what it is. This is the exact opposite of it. Usually it's a financial crisis, or the assets or the currency has gone down. Something happened, and people would call it a crisis. And that's kind of where I think it's a good time to pick up assets that are very, very expensive. And you lower by waiting for that crisis to happen, for that bust to happen. I think you lower your risk by picking up things at a low price or low valuation.
But isn't it a risk as well? What if the market doesn't go up, or you have to wait a long time for the market to go up or things to change? Because I believe that the risk that we are looking at is mostly political.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. And it can always go down, just because, the difference between something going down 80% and something going down 90% isn't 10%. That's a 50% decrease in price. And that 50% decrease is huge, because to make that up again, that means you have to go just to get back into back above water, you have to go up 100% from that 50% decrease. So it can get really hairy down at the bottom, and I think that's what scares people away.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, the flip side of that is it helps me a lot because a lot of times you know things are cheap during a crisis. They could get cheaper, but you know you're not investing in a bubble. You know you're not investing in assets that are overpriced. In fact, if anything, these assets, you can kind of look at the numbers and look at the metrics, and it seemed like everything's cheap. And that certainly was the case in Uzbekistan when I went there, coming up on about 6 years ago now.
So would you say that the expectation going in is low, hence the expectations from your investors is low as well? So they are already prepared that it is already so low, maybe it will go down a little bit further, but there, it's like it's already at the bottom, so the only way to move is up. Is that how your investors would see, I assume?
Well, my investors don't want to lose money, certainly.
Yeah.
They're paying me to make them money, to make them a halfway decent return. And thank goodness, inshallah, they like my story. They like what I'm doing. And they put money behind me, behind the strategy. And I've done this strategy for about 10 years, 7 years with the fund. So 6.5 years with the fund, almost 11 years now, and then 5 years by myself. Using my own money. So it's kind of proven not proven, I should say, but I've done okay for myself in the last 11 years since starting the strategy. And it's one of these things that I've never lost sleep over. And so when people look at valuations of stocks, or people invest in stocks that are hitting all-time highs all the time and have a huge PE ratio or huge valuation ratios, I couldn't sleep with that. But can I sleep with buying an Uzbek company that's trading at 3-4 times PE with a 10% dividend yield? Even though you have currency volatility, you don't have the disclosure that you want to get. To me, I'm okay with that. And some of my background has helped me being able to pull the trigger in newer markets like Uzbekistan.
Perfect. During our last conversation, you mentioned a lot of changes in policies and decrees were introduced, but nothing significant materialized. Before I ask you about that, can you share what opportunities do you actually see in Uzbekistan market right now?
Well, the equities are still really cheap. I was looking at my valuation tables. We do our own valuation because and collect all our own data for Uzbek stocks. I mean, it's available publicly, but we have to download it, put it in a format we like. And some of the ratios I particularly like are something I have to calculate manually. And so Uzbekistan is not available in our database. We pay. I won't even tell you how much we pay these super expensive, supposedly global databases, but they don't include Uzbekistan, unfortunately. But the valuation is still there. The changes on the macro side are still very, very positive. I've been attached, Uzbekistan, I think 3 times now in the last, 6, almost 7 years, and 6 years. And every time I go there, it's just progressing more and more each time. So you can see the changes on the street level, and you can start to see the changes in the earnings that we get and the coming out from the stocks that from our investments there. So it's not smooth sailing, but it's in the right direction.
Which markets would you say are the most interesting market for you at the moment? Is there any specific markets or any specific stocks that you see that, okay, this industry or this financial market or this stock is very interesting for you and it has a very positive future in Uzbekistan?
In Uzbekistan, I try not to talk about our portfolio too much. But generally, the companies that are kind of, you have a government involvement in just about all the companies in some shape or form, listed companies. But I generally favor the companies that have less government involvement than have more government involvement. Um, um,
Is it
just to give
because of the smooth sailing of the shares and dividend sharing as well?
um, well, generally governments aren't very good at operating businesses. And there's a lot of reforms that still need to take place in Uzbekistan. One thing I've noticed, I've taken trips to Kazakhstan and Ukraine and Russia. I guess that's it for this. But one thing I've noticed from all the from all the CIS countries, the ex-Soviet countries, is there's not much of an equity culture. In fact, one thing I don't. One thing I look for, one thing that's very positive in Uzbekistan is a very young population. In Ukraine, where I also went in about 2014, I think it was, I came across a term called red directors. And a red director is somebody who, very old style Soviet, typically older guy, um, and or women, and they think more about how to take money out of the company into their own personal accounts than they do about building up the company itself. And I'm very sensitive about that. I look, because if you have somebody who's think about investing in a business, right? Would you want the person you're partnering with taking money out of the business you put money into or that you've been working for? It's not going to work out, right? That's kind of 1+1=1, or 1+1=0 instead of 1+1=3 or 5 or 7, which is really what companies are about, working together, a group of people working together on something that's larger than themselves and creating value on top of value. So the red directors and that's what I worry about. Uzbekistan, I think there may be in some companies, even listed, you can tell that people are there in controlled situations where they're taking money out of the company and not acting for a minority or not acting for the best of the company. They're acting for the best of their self.
Yeah. So now coming back to our question, during our last conversation, you mentioned a lot of changes in policies and decrees were introduced, but nothing significant materialized. Are there any specific policies and decrees that you were actually hoping for, which would materialize, and that would actually change the game for Uzbekistan?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a series of things. I guess three things right off the bat. A couple of years ago, I'm just making a note on this to make sure I don't forget all three things.
No worries.
A couple of years ago, Uzbekistan was going to move to IFRS reporting, and one big difference, as I understand it, between IFRS reporting and Uzbek reporting is that IFRS has a better way of recognizing earnings from the subsidiaries and associates and consolidating those. So there's a company that we invested in that has a lot of subsidiary companies. And if they had moved to IFRS reporting, then their earnings probably would have been more realistic and also larger because they would include those subsidiaries and associates. And it'd be really good practice to do that. It makes guys like me, it makes my job easier to compare and contrast companies listed in Uzbekistan with companies listed elsewhere because they're so internationally, there's been a big move to IFRS reporting. So as I understand it, the decree is still there that firms are supposed to report using IFRS, but as far as I can see, only one or two companies has done it. And usually the listed public companies are the ones to first follow the letter of the law. And if they're not doing it, it probably means that it's for some reason, I don't know what happened, but people aren't following this change of rule. So something was stated, there's going to be a change, a positive change, but it hasn't happened. And there's a lot of reasons for it that people give me, but at the end of the day, it just hasn't happened. Second thing I was going to mention was, I think my second trip to Uzbekistan, maybe even my first one, there was a speculation that foreigners would be allowed to invest in banks. Now, foreigners can invest in banks. Foreign funds can. There's a lot of limitations on it. Particularly, there's a limitation of where that fund is listed. So almost all the jurisdictions that are very favorable to a global fund like us, Cayman, BVI, I know they don't have great reputations amongst the general public, but it's very helpful for a global shareholder base to invest in using these locations. And even a lot of places in the States, you couldn't form a fund and invest in Uzbek banks. To make a long story short, it's very, very difficult as a foreigner, as a foreign fund to buy bank shares. And these are some of the best, in my opinion, some of the best listed companies that are listed in Uzbekistan. And there were rumors or maybe even a draft decree, I forget which, that banks would be allowed to be invested in by foreigners. And that reminded me of Indonesia, because when Indonesia first opened up for foreign investment in 1989, foreigners were not allowed to invest in banks. And almost to the day when they changed that ruling, the Indonesian market all of a sudden became really interesting because you have a huge amount of market capitalization or potential companies that foreigners could invest in just overnight by the signing of a decree. You went from a small market that nobody was looking at to a market that all of a sudden people started to pay attention to, simply because they can invest in these well-run companies that were bigger. The third thing I'd say is that on the operational side, I don't know if there's been a lot of decrees or, ever since I've been there, the operations are very, very backwards. Everything's by paper. We have to sign the order. We have to seal it. We have to send it in. We can do it online, which is better, but the back office is spending, I've been to the back office of our broker in Tashkent, and he's spending an inordinate amount of time on paperwork. And also collecting dividends can be very difficult in Uzbekistan. In any other market, we have a almost an 8% position in Nigeria, and our dividends just kind of appear. There's nothing I really have to do. And that's in all the markets that we're in, except for Uzbekistan, where we have to write a letter, have to find out, we have to request our dividends. Sometimes we don't get paid, even though the dividend's been declared. So it's very, very backwards on the operational side.
Would you say that this restriction, I would say, is because of the merging markets between Uzbekistan's still dependence on Russian market a little bit, but at the same time going towards West as well?
To me, that's not a very valid excuse, to be honest with you. The Russian market, MOEX, is pretty well organized. I had direct investments there before. And again, we had no trouble trading shares or getting dividends from the listed companies. I don't know what it's like now. It's, Americans can't invest there for several years now. But we never had as much problem as we're having. It's not a big problem in Uzbekistan, but it takes an awful lot of time to get things. And Russia actually seems pretty well organized compared to Uzbekistan.
So in your 20 years of experience, more than 20 years of experience in investing in financial markets in Uzbekistan, you've seen a lot of changes coming in, as you mentioned earlier as well. How do you see next 5 years and the policies and the decrees that you've seen, which have been introduced now, and the policies which were introduced back then? How do you see the changes at the moment, and what do you see the future in the next 5 years?
Well, hopefully, everything they're doing on paper looks really good. The big thing is, will it actually happen? So the whole reorganization of the state-owned enterprises, putting them in and making them more private, privatizing them, it's all great news, but I don't think we've actually had that many real privatizations. And even those that we've had, I'm thinking of the cement company that went private about 2 years ago now. That wasn't really open and fair. And so everything on paper looks good, but then when you actually get to the implementation, either nothing happens or very little happens, or 1/4 of what you expect would happens. And so there was a big, I don't know if you call it decree or changing in law. I forget the name of what you what they call a piece of paper about reforming the capital markets. And so on paper, it looks all very, very good. The biggest question, but then again, I'm reading it thinking, is this going to be another just a piece of paper that will this piece of paper mean anything at the end of the day? Why don't we first, actually implement the past pieces of paper that have been passed, rather than come up with more proclamations and things.
Is there any specific decree or policy that you are looking forward for, something that you hope will actually make a big impact?
It all actually. There's just so much that needs to be done, to be honest with you. I mean, first get the dividends, make the dividends very easy to collect. Make sure that when companies declare dividends, they actually get paid. We've been waiting over a year sometimes for some of our dividends. We've gotten paid, but waiting a year and going back again and having to threaten a lawsuit. This is for a government-owned company, right? This is not a privately owned company. That's tough to do, and I can understand why people would not want to deal with that. I don't want to deal with it myself, and so I guess that the first thing that big for me is not so much seeing big changes that a politician would make or the capital markets would make. It's just actually making the changes rather than passing a new law or regulation.
Is there something unique or different you see in Uzbek market compared to other CIS countries that you have invested in?
I do, yeah. There seems to, well, the younger population, they seem to be a lot more, more open to new ideas, for lack of a better word, lack of a better expression. It seems to be, especially the younger people, seem to be a lot more privately oriented. They understand, they're investing. I talked to one person who was teaching a course there, and he was saying that it's very difficult to get youngsters interested in the local stocks because they're all investing in, the Bitcoin or Nvidia or Facebook and TikTok or stuff they actually use every day. So there's definitely a will to do that. And you can see on the bulletin boards, I'm on a few bulletin boards on Telegram on the Uzbek market, and there's been a lot more activity there in the last 18 months than I remember. And there was certainly, compared to what it was 6 years ago when I on that first trip to Uzbekistan, I could barely find a broker at all that would talk to me. I found a couple, but they were kind of the last two, I guess, or there was just a handful that survived in the last 10 years. They kind of were hanging on. When kind of the Uzbek market went into a long period of hibernation.
I recently saw one of my colleagues actually posted that they have signed some sort of an agreement with the government in terms of implementation for Bitcoin as well. Do you see some shift if it actually gets implemented properly?
Yeah, I don't know much about that. That's you have to ask somebody else. I don't really follow the crypto side,
Sure.
to be honest with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. Before we end, is there any advice you would want to give to future investors who want to actually venture into Uzbekistan? Is there something that they should be looking into?
Yeah, I'd say go up there. Just start digging around, and the only advice I can give is the same thing that I give myself. Just look where other people are not looking. I'm sure there's a lot. Excuse me, I'm not located in Uzbekistan, so there's a lot of stuff that could be uncovered there. There's a lot of really good, smart people that want to do the right thing. And there's a lot of people who don't want to do the right thing either. But aligning yourself with the guys that do want to do the right thing and be good to their minority investors, if you can find those people, stick with them and help them out maybe, or be one of those people yourself. But if I was to say, if a young person asked me where I'd put my money, I'd put my money there faster than I would in many other parts of the world.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.